Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for being here for this highly informative presentation about anti-slavery activity and the Underground Railroad in Chautauqua County. I'm Lisa Mertz, board member and chair of the program committee. First, I want to thank Peggy Tiffany for taking a role in organizing this event. Wendy Straight is here today to demonstrate the Chautauqua County Anti-Slavery Interactive Map, which grew out of research started in 2006 by the late Douglas Shepard with Wendy's assistance. Their findings were placed on this map by Nicholas Gunn in 2013. Wendy will show us how the map works and explain the academics behind it. Many of you would have received the link to the map in your email. I'll post it here in the chat. Please post your questions in the chat for Q&A following Wendy's presentation, and I'll read her the questions. So if we're all kind of calm down a bit, we can start. Okay, Wendy, do you want to share the screen? Ah, there it is.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me today. You're looking at the anti-slavery map that was mostly the work of Doug Shepard between 2006 and 2018. And I'm going to take a moment and make some more space on this desktop for me. Hold on just a minute. Okay. We lost Doug last year about this time at age 94, and many of you knew him, and we miss him greatly. So much of this is his work, and we thank Nicholas Gunner, who has provided us with a mapping platform for this work since 2013. And you'll notice it's geared for touchscreen. You'll hear a very noisy mouse here. I'm on a old school PC. And I'm not a very good driver on it. So you'll have to be patient when I take you from site to site. And it's very important to note that all but a small handful of sites here are private. They're not for visitors. And we're going to tour the map and visit a few of the people on the map and outline the major sources and dispel a few of the legends and hit the FAQs. So some background regarding slavery in New York. In 1799, slaves were redefined as indentured servants in New York State, and they were required to work as such and their children the same until the age of 28 for men and 25 for women. And that means the last indentured servants were technically freed of this obligation on the 4th of July, but not until 1827. And you know, the Holland Land Company began moving settlers into this area after 1808. So yes, there were some early Chautauqua County settlers who owned slaves, but many settlers, other settlers, had roots in Vermont and Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut. They had brought their strong anti-slavery stance right along with them. In order to join the national push for abolition, New York State began its anti-slavery society in the mid-1830s. And that's when Chautauqua County's national involvement begins intensely. First I better get you into somebody in Fredonia that many of you have heard about. This will be the Underground Railroad station of, I think somebody needs to mute. I'm hearing somebody. But this will be the Underground Railroad station of James Pettit, just northwest of Fredonia. You'll see some pictures when we get to the bottom here. And sometimes the slideshow will begin by itself. Let's see. That's the farm right there. That house is gone. There's a newer house now. Now, if you've watched the PBS series, you know that the underground began before the 19th century, notably by the Quakers and notably in the Carolinas. If you've read Fergus Bordwick's Bound for Canaan, or again, seen the Underground Railroad series on PBS, that early history is familiar to you. And the tricks of secrecy that were used by the Quakers continued here in Chautauqua County. Here we can look at a 25-year period of intense Underground Railroad activity, roughly from 1838 to 1863, with a watershed moment in 1851, which I'll explain in a bit. And if we piece together snippets of research, much of it compiled by William Siebert, who was a professor at Ohio State from 1891 to 1935, and then continued his work right to the end of his life, we find that there were two major trunk lines running north and south through the county. One of them came from Meadville, Franklin, roughly speaking. And I say that because the routes did not always go forward. They often went backward and sideways. But the main route went, again, from Meadville to Corry, and then through the southwestern portion of the county. The other came from Franklin, Pennsylvania, through Sugar Grove, PA, and through the northeastern portion of the county. And there are 5 major sources for the people on this map. And you're looking at the first. The son of this conductor, this station master, Eber Pettit, was a conductor and station master. And he wrote a memoir of the Underground Railroad, which makes this source a very rare source in the big picture, because it was deliberately created for posterity. People did not talk about the Underground Railroad. But here in Fredonia, we have an example of someone who actually wanted to. He published his memoir first for the Fredonia Censor newspaper, and then later it was published into a book. So as you're looking at James Pettit, I should tell you that this family came here from Utica in the mid-1830s. And they immediately joined the Fredonia Baptist Church, and they immediately helped establish the County Anti-Slavery Society. And they immediately set up an Underground Railroad station in Fredonia along Canadaway Creek, and almost immediately set up another family station in Versailles. So let me take you to that one. Let's do that again. Didn't work. Do it this way. We'll head over to Versailles Road. You'll see what a bad driver I am. I'm gonna try it again anyway, now that I've sort of refreshed the map. There we go. We're on the Cattaraugus Creek at the edge of the Seneca Nation. And that's Darwin R. Barker, who was the son-in-law of Eber Pettit. And Eber Pettit is the son of James Pettit. Together, Barker and Pettit lived in this home in Versailles, right here. That's the home just before it burned in the 1960s. Now there's a legend that Canadaway Creek, I'm sorry, I'm going to dispel another legend for you. There's a legend that Canadaway Creek in Fredonia was named for being a trail on the Underground Railroad. That's not so. Its name is the anglicized version of Ganadaway-o, which was the Seneca Nation's name for the stream. The first syllable actually refers to a stream, and the rest of it refers to running through the hemlocks. And you'll notice that that same first syllable is the root of our anglicized names for the Conewango and the Cattaraugus. Now, like all of these legends that began after the Civil War about the Underground Railroad, we can understand how the legend came about regarding the creek. The Pettits lived along the creeks because that's where the commercial enterprises were. There were 2 mills along the Canadaway Creek at Chestnut and Madison, where James Pettit lived, and there were 2 mills in Versailles, where Eber Pettit and Darwin Barker lived along the Cattaraugus Creek. So refugees did not usually walk the creeks between Underground Railroad stations, and that's because, and Pettit tells us very carefully, they were escorted overland by conductors. And likewise, there were no tunnels leading from residences to creeks or elsewhere. That is another common legend. And I know it's hard to get rid of these ideas. It was difficult for me, but it's easier if you remember looking at this map that the miracle of the Underground Network was not in hiding places. It was in the amazing cooperation of neighbors. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Now, Pettit tells us about how these refugees were escorted through these networks of neighbors. And also, refugees did not set off on their own in Chautauqua County looking for quilts or rings of trees or large rocks at street corners. Again, they were escorted by conductors. And so at this point, we need to acknowledge Paul Leone, who worked with the Fenton History Center, and Karen Levsey with the Fenton History Center. They have both been instrumental in helping us learn what really happened here. Paul found Pettit's book and republished it and wrote an informative foreword for the Culture and Times. And we should note that in his memoirs, and Paul noted this also, Pettit uses language that is extremely condescending toward African Americans. Like many Baptists of his time, he was true to his religious and political duty, but he still harbored an air of superiority toward his passengers. Also from Pettit, we learned something about the overzealous nature of abolitionists in general. For example, in Pettit's book, Joseph Norton's story shows us that abolitionists often forgot that enticing someone to leave servitude as a barber or a hotel waiter in a warm climate could lead that person to a more miserable life in the cold North, and it could cause severe punishment for the family that that person left behind. So on a brighter note, let me try to drive you someplace else here to the South County. Spelled it wrong. And we are with Katherine Harris in Jamestown. She is an African-American station master. And she lived in the section of Jamestown that was called Little Africa by the other Jamestonians. And this is a monument to her in the park near her home. And there's a display featuring her in the Fenton History Museum. She gave an interview in the early 1900s detailing how she had sheltered and fed and clothed all of the refugees who were brought to her by Jamestown Baptist conductor Silas Sherman. Katherine lived in the part of Jamestown that you would see when you first drive in and have to decide whether you're going to go toward Lakewood or toward WCA Hospital. And there is a monument to the place where her house used to stand. Now, she worked as a washerwoman for the rich families of Jamestown, and it's not clear how much financial assistance she received for any of her expenses as a station master. We can only hope that the Jamestown Baptist Church, where Silas Sherman attended, at least donated food and clothing. And we should move now to the South County, and unfortunately, this is another sad story. And this is the watershed moment that I was speaking of. We're at the farm of William Storham. He was in part African-American, and he had a station on the Underground Railroad. And it was here in October of 1851 that refugee Harrison Williams was recaptured by slave catchers disguised as women. He was raced through Jamestown to Dunkirk to Buffalo and faced a sham trial and was returned to slavery. This was an orchestrated test of the previous year's fugitive slave law by William's former owner in Virginia and his slaveholding neighbors. They were after Williams and/or any of 6 other refugees who had escaped with Williams from the same neighborhood in January 1851. And Doug found this. After Doug digested all of the newspaper stories about the recapture, there was an obscure note in the Warren, Pennsylvania archives. And that little note is a firsthand account passed down through a neighboring family, indicating that an idealistic and well-meaning abolitionist had returned to Virginia with 2 of William's escape party. They were hoping to purchase the freedom of the refugees' wives, and all were beaten to within an inch of their own lives, said the report. And that's how the bounty hunters discovered where to find Harrison. And that brings us to the other legend of the hidden rooms. Harrison was captured in the barn doing the morning chores. Up until that point, refugees did not need to rush out of Chautauqua County. So you might think, well, why wasn't he in a hidden room? There was no need to. He was, before the fugitive slave law, he was working on farms in the neighborhood. He was attending schools with the kids from those farms. So there wouldn't have needed to be any hidden rooms until the period between 1852 and 1863. And even then, country farmers were extremely poor, and they did not have the luxury of suddenly remodeling their homes. And the wealthy of Chautauqua County did not generally harbor refugees. After the fugitive slave law, the wealthy had too much to lose. Their part instead, Pettit tells us, was to secretly contribute money for the cause, if they were so inclined. And Pettit tells us they were called the stockholders. And here's where we should acknowledge the work of Dr. Judy Wellman, Professor Emerita from SUNY Oswego. She has studied all of the existing refugee narratives, and although she has found descriptions of persons and places, she has found no mention of hidden rooms. We'll speak a bit more on Dr. Wellman's work in a few minutes. But if no hiding places, how did the Underground Railroad work? And Pettit explains that it was an extremely tight operation. After the Harrison Williams case, refugees moved out of here fast. And the rest of his party, there were 4 who were still here, they were hastened away quickly too and made it to Canada. There were 2 other African-American conductors and station masters that we know about. So I'll take you to at least one of them. Let's see. We'll go to the Town Hotel. No, we won't. Yes, we will. We're going to the Town Hotel in Arkwright. We're way up in the hills above Fredonia. And it was here that John Little worked as a butcher. Around the corner, he and his son had a farm. And I can show you a few pictures. The hotel finally fell down in the 1950s, but there are some pictures of it. And I think the slideshow will take off on its own here. There it is. Now, the person with whom John Little traded places from time to time was Henry Davis in Fredonia. And for him, we have no picture. We have no picture of John Little. Henry Davis lived on Canadaway Creek, so there's another source of the rumor about the creek. He lived at the end of Little Hart Street in Fredonia. And the evidence about him is mostly circumstantial. He was the animal control officer for Fredonia, and Hart Street was renamed for him for about 10 years after the Civil War. For John Little, we have documentation through Pettit. And again, it was with John Little that Henry Davis sometimes traded places. A mile north of Chicken Tavern, as this hotel was called, right up about in here, the Hoke family was housing refugees who worked on the Erie Railroad, which, believe it or not, was supposed to pass right through here. And the bed is still there. The track was never laid because all of a sudden the route was changed to run through Forestville. Now, this all happened in the 1840s, and the Town Family Cemetery near Chicken Tavern is reported as the burial site for many refugees who died while working on that railroad bed. And coincidentally, they worked for Walter Smith, who was a wealthy real estate developer in Dunkirk. He lived at the corner of Central and 5th Street. It was a modest Greek revival that no longer stands. John Little is most likely buried with most of his family in the Chicken Tavern Cemetery, but the only visible monument is for one of his sons who served in the Civil War. And that leads us to major source 2 of the 5. So we'll go a little further. This time, maybe I can drive you, if I can drive and talk at the same time. I don't know. Here we are in the little community of Hamlet, and we're going to head up on the hill, high up on the hill, on the South Hill Road to the farm of Benjamin Vincent. We don't have a picture of Benjamin Vincent or of his farm, but we do have this. Here we find the names of several Underground Railroad participants. The little village of Omar, now called Hamlet, was home to more people who worked on the railroad. In fact, the bed can still be seen this far. That's as far as it got before the route was changed. The station of Benjamin Vincent, he was a blacksmith and a farmer, by the way, came to the world's attention because of his granddaughters who grew up on the farm and knew about his work. And in the 1930s, they found this list, which they took to the Fredonia newspaper where it was published. Naturally, that's where Doug found it. And on it were the names of all of Vincent's neighbors who had contributed items of clothing and possibly money. And next to each name, Vincent had listed the items donated and monetary amounts, which could be the value of the item or possibly a cash gift. Less likely that it's a cash gift. More likely it's the value of the item intended for that person to be able to count that gift toward his or her annual pledge to the little Baptist church or the little Methodist church, which stood side by side across the Conewango on today's Butcher Road. And I'll look at one of the neighbors. All of these neighbors were on his list. And this one, I think, is Amy Anna Smith. And you can see that she donated a pair of cotton stockings and a pair of shoes. Would have been difficult for these families to sacrifice these things. But if we go back down to Hamlet and zoom in on one particular family, you'll see a slightly different situation. This family made their fortune. You recognize something there if you're from Fredonia. This family made their fortune with an ashery in Hamlet or Omar, and I'm sure that they had hoped that the railroad would pass through here as well. This is Charles Mark and his father. Charles later donated the water fountains to the two parks in downtown Fredonia. You can see that they donated 10 yards of sheeting, a cloak, a dress, and a coat. And later, besides donating fountains to Fredonia, Charles served more than a quarter century on the Normal School board, the Normal School having been the predecessor to SUNY Fredonia. Now, it's important to know that all the people on Vincent's list knew full well that their gifts were for refugees, and they knew full well that their neighbor was a station master. Another probable conductor right here in Omar, in fact, if Vincent were the station master, then it's very probable that Smith is the conductor who would lead people between stations. He is right here, and I'll tell you more about him in a moment because his name comes from two sources. And now I'll take you not too far away, a little further north. We'll visit another lady. There she is. We'll find her up here in Nashville, due east of Forestville. Nashville was a crossroads for two cattle driving trails. And before we visit Ruth, I'll take you to this little church. This Baptist church is probably where several anti-slavery meetings were held. And this is where petitions were signed. The third major source of names on this map comes from the petitions that Dr. Wellman found in the National Archives. There are only a few of the many hundreds that were sent because Dr. Wellman tells us that petitions in DC were used as kindling for fires on cold nights, and most of those petitions did not survive. But she found everything she could for New York and sent them to each county historian. And Doug managed to decipher the names here in Chautauqua County, and we found their probable homes. This beautiful Greek Revival building has been saved by the neighbors who purchased it and do whatever they can to keep it standing. So we'll go back to Ruth for a moment, because here's a miracle of survival of petitions, because it shows us that women signed them, even though they could not vote. We don't have a picture of her or of her farm. And women were supposed to be quiet, but look what they said. I'm quoting now: "The undersigned females respectfully pray," etc. And what they were hoping for in 1844 was to protest the annexation of Texas to the Union with a constitution that expressly sanctions slavery. But if we look here at her husband's petition, he signed a similar petition about Texas, but he also signed one protesting slavery in Washington, D.C. And his petition begins, "The undersigned legal voters of Hanover, Chautauqua County." And as long as we're talking about women's work in the Underground Railroad, let's go to Ellington and look at this lady, if she'll go. Let's see. As was typical in the anti-slavery network, there were many medical doctors. And in Ellington, we have 3 of them. And Melvina Brooks was the wife of one of them. And she was a member of this Congregationalist church. The Congregationalists were known anti-slavery people. She corresponded with William Still in Philadelphia. Don't know where that's coming from. Are you seeing that too? Anyway, let me quickly tell you about her. If you have been watching the PBS series, you know about William Still. He was also featured in the movie Harriet, but that was a somewhat fictionalized character. Melvina corresponded with him, and the letter survives. She was telling him that the materials such as clothing and books, etc., from Ellington were going to be sent to him rather than to Syracuse. She'd been informed that his station needed them more at that moment. And I'll take you now to the 4th major source. And those of you familiar with the map are waiting for this gentleman to appear, because he was Chautauqua County's 3rd and most prominent historian. And his papers were saved and archived after they were used for Andrew Young's 1875 history of Chautauqua County. And the Chautauqua County Historical Society has placed them online. It takes forever to get to his slideshow because his story is really long. And here is the foot home is at the site of the Jamestown High School, the former foot home. He was a medical doctor and a lawyer. There he is. And again, it was his son, Horace, who helped to archive his papers. And let me get you back to, I think if I can show you a bit of Jamestown, you'll see how many names came from this entire series of dots comes from the foot papers. He saved the letters that he corresponded, that he received in correspondence with other anti-slavery people. He saved copies of his own letters, and he saved copies of the petitions that he circulated. He also saved a list that his son thinks is a list of Underground Railroad conductors, and on that is Russell O. Smith, we mentioned back in Omar. And so it's thought by Foot's son Horace that Smith was a conductor, and Smith also signed a petition. And that brings us to the fifth source of a large number of names. And that is a miracle find in the Baptist archives, the Fredonia Baptist Church. If I list for you here all of the Baptist churches that are on this map because of that archives, you'll get an idea of the number of names that come from this little set of 2 books that were found by accident in the back of the closet where the choir music was kept. And they're 2 little volumes of annual meetings, little pamphlets of annual meetings of the Erie Baptist Association. They were bound into books by the anti-slavery man who was the clerk of the church from 1848 for the next 40 years. And he also saved individual pamphlets from the Harmony Baptist Association. And altogether, that collection tells us, let's see, let's go to one of these churches first. That collection, this will be the Leon Baptist Church, which I'll tell you about in a second. It tells us that the 2 associations, the Harmony Baptist Association and the Erie Baptist Association, each straddled one of those 2 trunk lines I had told you about. So Harmony Baptist Association is over here. Erie Baptist Association is over here, coincidentally or not. And we're going to this tiny Greek Revival Baptist Church in Leon. And I'm going to read to you now a typical statement that was passed at the annual meetings of the Baptists when they unanimously passed a resolution like this. We deeply deplore the connection of the Baptist denomination with the sin of slavery, and we recommend that they labor for its extinction, which means they were not only working behind the scenes, they were working, signing petitions, they were working politically, any way they could to abolish slavery. It's this little church where Foote came to speak and to establish an anti-slavery society. And it was from this little church that delegates came to those annual meetings. And about 15 years ago, when Casey Painter brought these photos into my office, Matthew Petro said about this one, "O Lord, bless this automobile which we are about to receive." And I think that you'll agree that we owe a debt of gratitude to the family that saved the building for whatever purpose. It's a handsome little Greek revival from the 1840s. Now, the people and reference material that we see on the map are only the tip of the iceberg. You see a lot of dots here, but just imagine if we had all of the church records, especially the Congregationalists and the Wesleyans, if we had all of the petitions and all of the conductors lists for those who gave towels or shoes or coats. If we had all of the records of the local anti-slavery ladies' societies, if we had the diaries and the family Bibles of those who recorded their Underground Railroad activity, I think you'd see nothing but cluster bubbles on this map, and you'd see more people than trees. And the current research indicates that about 30,000 refugees found their way to Canada. Through this county, the conservative estimate is about 1,000. The outside estimate up to 5,000, but recall that we can only document a handful by name because that's how secret the activity was. Doug would want me to mention all of his help from the Chautauqua County Historical Society, in particular, County Historian Michelle Henry, and from the County Genealogical Society, in particular, Lois and Norwood Barris and Donna Johnson and Richard Scheel and Wayne Leamer and all of their predecessors. And for images of 19th century houses, wherever they still exist, we thank Casey and Matt, I just mentioned, and Matt's grandmother, Cassadaga Valley historian, the late Audrey Prosser, and her amazing sister, Cherry Creek historian, the late Joyce Chase. And this work began not for Underground Railroad research, but as part of the County Historic Structures database. So our thanks to Nathan Town for managing and posting that data set for so long, and to Jim Mazumdar and Nick Gunner for recently migrating Nathan's work to a mapping platform like this one. And with that, I will turn to Lisa, who's been collecting some questions for me, and I'll stay right here at the map and maybe I can answer something.
Okay, there's a couple of questions in the one person, Joan Rosenthal, asked, was Benjamin Vincent related to Bishop John Vincent from Chautauqua? Do you know?
I don't know that, but that is a good question. The Vincent name is still prominent in the area on the border between Chautauqua County and Cattaraugus County, several families with that name. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of them have used Ancestry to trace the connections to other Vincents in Chautauqua County.
That may be a question for the Chautauqua Archives guy. Judy asked, she said, I noted my husband's family, the Woods, all signed petitions. How effective were the petitions?
That's a good question. Jennifer, if you're there, if you're there, Dr. Wellman or Dr. Hildebrand, would you care to answer either of those? That's the big picture.
Dr. Wellman, if you'd like to jump in. If not, I can say that, you know, in the long term, I'd say they were somewhat effective. In the short term, maybe less so. I think the big question is how we want to measure effectiveness. Effectiveness in changing policy. That's again sort of the long-term effect. I think that the petitions were part of something that built up and built up and built up over decades to ultimately help lead to the Civil War. But in the short term, I think one of the things that they could do very effectively was to help unite people around their common cause, especially in local areas. So continue to build up strength, continue to build up fortitude, continue to build up perseverance, even as they are facing it after 1850, for example, the much more harsh fugitive slave law. So I think the answer is yes, that they were effective, but I think that comes with an asterisk in terms of effective over a long period of time and effective in smaller situations. So I certainly don't want to brush under the rug any of the important work and contributions that those petition signers did, but we're talking about an institution that had been ingrained in American thought and American institutions for, by that point, several hundred years. So it takes a while to make that change. So I hope that that's useful in some ways.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you.
Okay, Nancy Adams says, Wendy, this is extraordinary, which I think we could probably all agree with.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Lisa.
And Nancy Boynton asks, were there a lot of pro-slavery people in the area?
There was one in particular, and I don't know if we would call him pro-slavery or more laissez-faire. And that was DeVilla White, son of Dr. Squire White. We know, famous because of the White Inn. It's part of DeVilla White's house that's still built into the White Inn. DeVilla White was so angry about the anti-slavery people in Fredonia that he published an ad. There was another paper in Fredonia that was there. Let me back up. There was the anti-slavery Fredonia Censor, and there was the anti-foreigners, anti-Catholic Fredonia paper called the Fredonia Advertiser. Now that Fredonia Advertiser didn't last very long, and you can imagine why. I mean, Fredonia was basically anti-slavery. But DeVilla was so angry about abolitionists that he published an ad in the Advertiser saying that all of his property was for sale because he wanted to get out of this blank town. And I will not tell you what that word was, but you can imagine. And the ad was picked up by the anti-slavery paper and published there as well. And the editor said, I'm happy to run your advertisement here free of charge because we will be very happy for you to leave.
Judy Lutz Woods asks, with the Underground Railroad locations in Dunkirk and along Lake Erie, were those seeking freedom often transferred by boat?
Oh,
Are there detailed historical records of the boat owners or small rig captains? Oh, that's from Michelle.
okay. There is one that, thanks to Michelle, we know about. Let's see. We do know that Captain Titus left on steamer from Dunkirk and took passengers to, let's see, I'll have to zoom way out. He took his passengers to Fort Malden, way over here, south of Windsor. And he was able to do that because this was a stop for fuel. So people could disembark here. And this is a known stop on the Underground Railroad. And
Oh,
Dunkirk
that's really cool.
Dunkirk is definitely connected to it. We hear about Titus in Pettit, and then other sources tell us more about what he did. And we can find where he lived in Buffalo. So yes, we do have one connection. And it can be guessed that there were equally as many refugees who were transported from Barcelona harbor. But unless Michelle wants to, do you have any more information about that harbor? I really do not know at this point.
No. Someone asks, where to go? Oh, Joan Rosenthal asks, how can someone contact Wendy Straight? Wonderful, insightful presentation. Wendy had asked me to put her email in the chat, but like I was afraid, I don't want Wendy to get trolled or anything. You know, so,
Okay, here you go.
but we may have a pretty clear group right now. So if you want to put it in, I can put it in.
I can just tell you it's pretty simple. It's Wendy, WENDY, at netsync.net, NETSYNC.net, Wendy at netsync.net.
Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Mary Croxon asked, did many of the freedom seekers come by way of Pittsburgh?
Probably. As I don't trace the routes specifically back beyond Franklin, Pennsylvania and Meadville, Pennsylvania, because again, the main trunk lines were very fluid, and someone could easily be transported from one trunk line to another if there was a thought that they might be being pursued. They might be moved sideways from one trunk line to another. So yes, I'm sure that people could have come through Pittsburgh. They also could have come from Cleveland because there was a lakeshore route. So if someone was thought to be pursued through Ohio, it is very possible, very likely that that person would have been sent along the lakeshore route to another port other than an Ohio port.
Roxanne Peterson asked if there's a particular state that refugees came from. The whole South, right?
That I don't know. Jennifer, Michelle, Dr. Wellman, I do not know specifically. I know many from Virginia because it was close by. And Maryland.
I was asking because I know that that in migration patterns, there are certain states that show up in certain places. Like a lot of people migrated from North Carolina to say Chicago or you know, and I just wondered if that was true here.
And it may well be, and we're, as Fergus Bordwick pointed out in the early 2000s, it's only because of the internet that so much scholarly research can be shared now. And it's unfortunate that that didn't happen until so much of the original documentation disappeared. But it's not too late. And the more that people share, the more that they can uncover. And your question is a good one. It needs to be pursued.
And Wendy, I'll just add that in terms of sort of national patterns, we know that the vast majority of enslaved people who ended up taking part in the Underground Railroad as we know it came from the northern states. Those who were in the southern states were far more likely to do one of two things. A few of them ran further south, even to Mexico. And there's actually a new book. I wish I could plug the title, but I don't remember it. But there's a new book out that looks at the runaways to Mexico. But the other thing that a lot of the deep South enslaved people did was to run to deep South cities, because in the city you could easily become anonymized. You could get a job with people who weren't too interested in checking your papers if you worked for a low sum. So the other thing to keep in mind is that there was a significant divide in terms of where and how people ran who did go north based on the Appalachian Mountains. That's a pretty huge divide there. So where you left from often had a lot to do with where you ended up. And so the people from Pittsburgh we were talking about, I think more of them ended up on a route that would more likely take them to New York City than through our traffic. But I'm not positive about that. I'd have to go back and check some maps.
There's one question. Do we know what happened to the Little family? I believe some moved to Forestville, but no one lives here now, from Nancy Adams.
Nancy, I'm not sure if there are descendants still in the area. Their final home was in Perrysburg, so there very could well be in Forestville or Gowanda area.
Would there have been a route across Lake Erie?
Probably several, because we know of the route from Dunkirk to Fort Malden, which is probably the farthest distance. We can assume that there were probably several shorter routes. I think that it would have been common usually to head toward the Buffalo area. But again, that would be dependent upon whether someone were being pursued and expected to be found at Black Rock. Then it would be more likely that that refugee would be placed on a westbound steamer rather than a northbound steamer.
I know there's a lot of info up in Niagara Falls, and there's a relatively new museum that shows how they went across the Niagara River, and hit the other side and were free. It's really interesting, but I haven't been able to go there because of the pandemic. I was going to go then. Gretchen and Jim Pelletier say, fabulous presentation, Wendy. We bought a home at 21 Hamlet in Fredonia and were told by the sellers that this home's foundation was the third oldest in Fredonia and that it was part of the Underground Railroad. Friends also said that they played in a tunnel on the side of the house that was a hidden entry exit point to the basement. Any basis to any of this that you know of?
Thank you, Gretchen and Jim. Thank you. The fact that there were anti-slavery people on Spring Street and Hamlet Street is known. That's a fact. And that's how the rumors get started about the hidden rooms. But the hidden rooms idea is a fallacy, and I'll give you an example. I grew up next to Fredonia's Octagon House, and we were all told by children, including the father in that family, that that was an Underground Railroad station, and that the window that led from the basement outside was part of a tunnel, and that the remains of the old swinging bridge down at the creek was part of the Underground Railroad. The house and nothing else associated with it, including the bridge, had been constructed until 1870. So there's no way that any of that could have been true, but we grew up believing it, and everyone in Fredonia was told that this and that was an Underground Railroad station and hidden room. And again, I was telling people before we began the presentation that it's so hard to give up that legend that we held for so long. But if you look at the big picture in Chautauqua County and the network, you realize that that's the amazing aspect of the whole enterprise, that all of these neighbors knew each other and worked together so well and so secretly, and that even the few among them who were not part of the anti-slavery cause still kept quiet. It's a true legend in Chautauqua County that no one ratted out anyone else. The sheriff who helped the bounty hunters get to Harrison Williams was very promptly unelected.
Wow. Marcia Johnson says, this gives me some pride in our area. Thank you so much, Wendy, for the information. And Jennifer Hildebrand says, would you talk just a little bit about the expertise that you, Doug, and Nick brought to this project independently? I think one of the real strengths of the project is the interdisciplinary expertise you each contributed.
Well, thanks, Jennifer. You always ask me the toughest questions. Nick brings to us, of course, his expertise in computer science and his mapping platform at orbitus.com. And he approached us in 2013, telling us that he could convert the paper map that we'd made for the 2011 History Fair into a very effective interactive map for us. And we said, by all means, please, we'll be your guinea pig. We'll do it. And Doug, for his part, was a professor in the English department who had special expertise in library science. And he taught all of the research courses at Fredonia, and then spent 30 years as the lead researcher at the Barker Museum. For my part, I'm just a map person. So I just jumped in wherever it was helpful to get people onto the 1854 county map.
Michelle Starwalt Wood says, approximately how many homes have opened their doors for history days or some other event to explore any hiding places? Will there be a tour in the next few years by any historical society or group? Thank you so much for the information.
So the question is, have any have any homes been on the tour, and will they be on the tour, and has to do with hiding places?
Yeah, have they been able to be explored, homes explored for hiding places?
I think that each time we hear about a home with a hiding place, people do come to us and ask us to look at the history of the home to verify whether or not the family living there at the time was part of the anti-slavery network. So to do that kind of research, we look at the religious affiliation, the political affiliation, to see if there are any family histories anywhere, such as at ancestry.com, diaries, family Bibles, any church records that would give us any indication of that family's involvement. And then, of course, you have to, if you're really looking for a hidden room, you have to look at the architecture of the house. There is a reputed hidden room in the South County that's next to a fireplace. And I cannot imagine a person being put in a narrow hiding place next to a burning fireplace. So that one doesn't necessarily make sense. And that's what we have to look at.
Yeah. Jennifer Hildebrand says, great, accessible, and short article out there by Carol Kamen, Kammen, The Underground Railroad and Local History, talks a bit about some of the myths and truths associated with the Underground Railroad. It specifically addresses tunnels. If anyone would like a copy, feel free to email me, and that's jennifer.hildebrand@fredonia.edu.
Jennifer's always got my back. I'll take it, Jennifer.
Well, there's a museum in Ohio. I just wanted to mention that they said that the conductor had space behind the walls where he could hide people, and also that what he had was a cart with a false bottom, so he had people like under that false bottom when he was transporting them in the cart. And that was kind of an interesting, I haven't been able to go there yet either, but I'd love to see that museum. But
Yeah, I think
also Henry Louis Gates mentioned that there are some hidden rooms, not as many as anybody ever thought, but there are a few here and there. So who knows, you know?
it takes an awful lot to document one. And the story about the hidden places and wagons is more easily to document, because if a person was being carried from a farm to the lakeside or to the railroad station or to another home and was being pursued, there is a chance that you would have to help that person hide under something.
Mm-hmm. So are there any more questions or any questions that I missed? You can raise your hand at this point. We don't have as huge a crowd as we started out with. So, okay, well, thank you so much, Wendy. This was just really a fantastic presentation. I know everyone really enjoyed it a lot. So I'm going to stop the recording.
Yeah, and I would like to add my personal thanks to Wendy, because when I called her and asked her if she would do this, she immediately said yes.